Alexander the Gander by Tasha Tudor. This book is read for my grandchildren by your loving Amma. That is Alexander the Gander. It's another wee story for Sylvie. One day, Sylvie Ann took Wiggy and her two geese, Alexander and Arminta, for a walk to the pond. On the way, they passed Mrs. Fillow's house. Mrs. Fillow was setting out heliotrope pansies in her garden. Look at how loving Mrs. Fillow is. Alexander was very fond of heliotrope pansies and stuck his long neck through the fence to see if he could reach some. "Shoo, shoo, you naughty gander," said Sylvie, and she had to flap her pinafore at him before he would leave the fence and come walking. Let's see if we can look nice and close at this picture. When Sylvie and Wiggy and Alexander and Arminta came to the pond, Sylvie Ann took her shoes and stockings off and went wading. Wiggy went to hunt frogs among the lily pads. Is he getting any? Oh, look at that. I think he sees some. And Alexander and Arminta swam to the middle of the pond to dabble for pond weeds. Do geese like pond weeds? I think they do. But Alexander just couldn't forget those heliotrope pansies. He swam to the bushes at the edge of the pond and looked around. He sneaked away and started up the road, making flat, damp footmarks in the soft dust. Ooh, I wonder what kind of trouble he's going to get into. When Alexander came in sight of Mrs. Fillow's house, he took a shortcut by way of the vegetable garden. For, thought Alexander, I might just as well try a few young carrots and lettuces and finish up with the heliotrope pansies for dessert. He was very careful to make sure Mrs. Fillow didn't see him. Luckily, the garden gate was open. He walked in and began with a row of lettuce seedlings. Look at that. He's being sneaky, isn't he? Then 3 hills of young bean plants with a wee bit of cabbage here and there to add flavor. Do you eat cabbage to add flavor? Sounds good to me. When he had had enough, he walked up the lane past the currant bushes and across some newly washed tablecloths to Mrs. Fillow's flower garden. Oh no, I think I see some trouble brewing. Look at that. Mrs. Fillow was nowhere in sight. Alexander quacked with anticipation as he saw the neat rows of heliotrope pansies just waiting to be gobbled up, thought Alexander. He's a happy duck. Actually, he's a goose, isn't he? But Mrs. Philo thought quite differently, as that moment she discovered him from her kitchen window. What's she making? Looks like she has jam on her kitchen window. Cherry jam, maybe? She shrieked at Alexander and frightened him so badly that he thought of feather beds and roast goose both at once. Oh, look at that. He's squawking loudly. You can imagine that Alexander left very abruptly by way of a rose trellis. Look at that lovely picture. Just then, Sylvie and Wiggy and Arminta came back from the pond looking for him. They found him hurrying across the pasture towards home. Sylvie and Wiggy ran after Alexander and caught him and brought him back to apologize to Mrs. Philo for doing such naughty things. He's a naughty gander, isn't he? Alexander hung his head and looked dreadfully ashamed. So Mrs. Philo pardoned him because she's very nice. Then Mrs. Philo went to the kitchen and came back with cambric tea and cookies for herself and Sylvie, and some stale biscuits for Wiggy, Alexander, and Arminta. They all sat about the doorstep and enjoyed their tea very much. Oh, that looks very nice, doesn't it? But I'm afraid Alexander never felt properly sorry for what he did, because he still has a dreadful fondness for young vegetables, and especially for heliotrope pansy. He eats them whenever someone forgets to close the garden gate. The end. And that was Alexander the Gander. I hope you enjoyed it.